My name is Vickie. I'm an addict. I'm really grateful to be here and grateful to be clean. Let me pass on to you something that I learned from my sponsor. Just indulge me for a moment. Would you please close your eyes and imagine two things? Okay. First thing I want you to imagine and remember is the most degrading thing, the most hopelessly out of control thing that you did in active addiction. The second thing I would like you to imagine is the hopes and dreams that in recovery you have. Open your eyes. Me too. This is a program of identification, of empathy, of hope. This is a program that brings desperate, dying people alive again. And I am blessed. And I want you to know that I am blessed because we are blessed. I came in here with no hope. I came in here because this was the last house on the block. I had tried medicine, religion, and psychiatry. I did not have anywhere else to go, and I did not think that drugs were the problem. I thought the lifestyle was the problem, and I had no understanding that they were totally related one to the other. I did not understand that the violence and my choice of people to be involved with was totally tied up with that I got high. My last 6 months of using, I thought today is the day I die. My last 6 months of using felt like I had willingly given myself to the devil. My last 6 months of using, I had nowhere else to go, and I stayed where I was. I stopped shooting dope and hitting the pipe 2 years before I got clean, thinking that it was one particular drug that caused me all those problems, that brought me to my knees. You know, I had no understanding that for an addict to use, any drug is deadly. Any drug is deadly. And I was the kind of addict who used, I had maintenance drugs. And what I would do is I would binge on harder drugs, and my pattern was to use those drugs until I hit a bottom and burnt myself out. And that was a pattern that worked for years. I would use whatever drugs got me the highest, did what I wanted them to do, and then when they were out of control, when it was just too much for me, I would just stop doing them, and I would go back to smoking and drinking, thinking that that was my idea of getting clean. When I was in my mid-20s, first time I ever tried to get clean, I was shooting PCP with some biker friends, and I thought that I had arrived. I thought that this was exactly what I wanted because it felt like a spaceship on ball bearings. And that is exactly what I wanted drugs to do to me. And what happened is I started abscessing on my arms, and I got real scared. And so I stopped doing that. I made these lifestyle changes, and I got a job, and so I was just back to drinking and smoking, thinking that, of course, it was that particular drug that was the problem. When I first started using, I felt like I was finally connected to other people. I'm a loner by nature. I like people. I like talking to them. I'm really interested in what you have to say to me, but I will do it alone. 9 times out of 10. It never occurred to me to, before I came here, before I speak, I always pray. And I always pray alone. And I have a sponsee who came with me, and I said, I'm going to go on the deck and I'm going to go pray. And she said, do you want me to go with you? And my first response was no. No, because I always pray alone. And then I thought, why do I do this to myself? I have someone who's willing to lend their spirit to mine. And I said no. So we prayed together. And I never had anyone pray with me before I speak. You know, I always pray with my sponsees before we start steps. But no one had ever offered to pray with me, nor had I ever thought to ask someone to pray with me before I speak. It is my nature to do things alone. When I got here, I preferred to get high alone. There were only 2 things that made me feel connected to other people. One was drugs and the other was sex. And those 2 things, by the time I got here, were so out of control and so damaging to me that there was nothing that made me feel connected to other people. There was nothing. And I remember when I first started using, and I hit my first drug of choice, and I remember the lie that this disease told me, and I remember when this lie was, I became aware of this lie, and this lie was that we are all isolated, that there is nothing that connects any of us except these little thin filaments of getting high and having sex. Those are the only things that connect us to each other. Otherwise, we are alone in this universe. And that's how I lived my life. And that's what I believed until I came in these rooms. And when they said to me, the lie is dead, that is the lie that died first. That is the lie that died first in my step toward recovery. I was not alone anymore. And I didn't come in here brimming with love and wanting to be part of. I came in here because this was the last house on the block. There was just nowhere else to go. I had, in the course of my addiction, I had been very violent in the beginning of my addiction. And by the end of my addiction, the violence was visited on me. I thought nothing of being abusive to my first husband. That was nothing. I mean, that's how I got his attention. You know, by the time I walked into these rooms, I thought my husband was going to kill me. Every day I would think, today is the day he kills me. I grew up in the country. I went to a high school that had maybe 52 people in my graduating class. I had, my mother died when I was 10 and a half. My dad remarried a widow who had 4 children. I was the oldest of his 2, and within 3 years they had 2 more. So I went from being the oldest of 2 to being the 3rd oldest of 8 children. And it was a culture shock that took me well into recovery to get over. My first family was very touchy, very feely. My second family was not. My first family told me different things, like where babies came from. My second family wouldn't talk about that. So what I decided from that is that all people lie, that the world's just full of liars, and I couldn't trust anyone. And no one told me what the word. Nobody said grief to me. Nobody said depression, and I didn't know that when someone that you love dies, that you grieve. I didn't know that, and I thought I was mentally ill, and I brought that into adulthood. I didn't know that it is normal for a child to be sad and to grieve when their parent dies. I didn't understand any of that. I didn't understand anything about feelings. I survived a long time into my addiction because of the gift, one of the gifts my family gave me, and it was not a good gift, but it was one of the things they did give me, is the ability to look good on the outside no matter what's going on the inside. You know, I was dancing as fast as I could by the time I came into these rooms, keeping ahead of this disease. And So I got out, I graduated from high school. I went and did a year of college. Then I ended up doing 3.5 years in the military during the Vietnam War, and I worked in the hospital corps. I was stationed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and lived in South Philly. I was in charge of ordering drugs for my ward, so I ordered theirs and mine. I met my first husband during this period. He was getting kicked out because he was sleepwalking. You can't sleepwalk when you're on like a destroyer. So they put him out. I met him. We got married. I had no ability to have deep feelings. I married him because he cared whether or not I had a good time in bed and liked drugs. That was like good enough for me. That's a good reason to marry somebody. So we were just a couple of like bachelors partying, and we got high all the time. I went to work loaded. The military during that period was very sexist. You had bad girls and good girls, and I had short hair, made sure I wore little earrings, so I looked like one of the good girls, and because of my ability to hustle, nobody ever thought I was one of the bad girls. And I made it out of there, ended up moving to Ohio, and I left my first husband because I decided that he was inhibiting me sexually. I had all these guys I wanted to sleep with, and I was such an honest person that I couldn't, I said, look, I'm going to go have sex with this guy, and he'd go, Vickie, don't do that. Just don't do that. Don't do that. And I'd go, oh, but I am. And I would. And I had no understanding. It was my way or no way. And we ended up getting divorced. I met my first... I didn't have my first broken heart until I was in my 30s. In fact, I had no sense of any kind of feelings. I was dating this guy when I was in school, and I saw him leave with this woman, and I followed them to his house, and I stood outside his door, and I realized they were having sex. And so he lived in this apartment building with this long hallway. And so I'm standing in this long, narrow hallway, pounding in his door and screaming. And he finally comes to the door. And on my way there, of course, I drank 2 40s. It just didn't occur to me to do anything else. That's just what you do. And so he comes to the door, and I'm like... this is a very timid, sweet woman that he went home with. He had talked to me about her once, and I'm going, oh, I thought you didn't like fucking her. I was just like vicious, and this little woman sort of cowering in the background. And he's totally naked, and he comes out, and I start hitting him and beating him up, and he pushes me, and I fell down, and he had this long hair, and he bent over me and went, oh, Vickie, are you okay? And so I pulled his hair and pulled him down and started beating him up again, screaming and yelling, and I'm out of control. I swear to God, there was probably foam coming out of my mouth. And I just tell you that story because that's really how I was. That is really how I was. And so after that scene, I went to my girlfriend's house. She wasn't there, so I broke in her house and sat in her living room until she got home. And I said, I don't know what's the matter with me. And 2 of my girlfriends showed up, and they said, Vickie, you're jealous. And I'm going, I don't think so. I'm just not capable of those kind of feelings. So being that kind of person who's in control and wants what she wants and insists on doing it her way, I ended up getting into a 5-year relationship. First 3 years were great sex. Last 2 years were spent me kicking him to the curb, him kicking me to the curb, me trying to win him back so I could be the one kicking him to the curb. And I had a baby girl during that period. And if I could have written God a letter, this girl, this baby, was everything I wanted. God was good to me. God was good to me in spite of myself. And during that pregnancy, I was able to keep a lid on how much I was using. I just smoked a little reefer, didn't drink. I was trying to be really good about it. And then she was born, and her dad and I went our separate ways, and I got involved with this other guy who was from Columbus. And he had been a drug dealer in Columbus. The bottom fell out of his drug dealing because of the violence in his personal life. He had divided up his business and moved to his home in Jamaica. I met him when he came back into the United States, and he was busted in Miami with some drugs. So he was sort of stuck in the United States when I met him, and that made him my captive audience. And this is when my using went from me being the bitch in control to me being whatever I could be to get whatever I wanted to get high. And I can't say that I didn't do that before, but it always seemed like it was on my terms, and I was able to stop it at some point when I felt too degraded. And this is not a story about which drugs were bad or which drugs were worse, but this is just what happened to me. He introduced me to shooting cocaine and hitting the pipe. And this was the first drug I had ever run into that I could not stop using. And I did not like it. It was never my drug of choice. I just couldn't stop doing it once I started. And what happened is he went away. He got this letter from the federal government saying, please go to prison now. And you know, the federal government was so different than local government. And when I met him, he was the softest spoken guy I'd ever met. He was thoughtful. He rolled my joints for me. And is that a gentleman or what? He was a good cook. He had these 2 little girls he was raising. I thought he had murdered their mom, but I didn't care because you know, that won't happen to me. This is what addicts say, that won't happen to me, and I can handle it. But he was 1,000,000 feet tall, big guy. And so he went away to Terre Haute. And my idea of controlling my drugs this time was to just become hysterical if anyone came near me with any kind of cocaine in any form. And because I didn't understand how to say no. You know, that just say no stuff that's so stupid. And so what I would do is I would be very careful not to go around anyone who could supply me. And if they did offer it to me, I would just become hysterical. And then that was one of the tools I used to try to stay off that. And the other tool I used is I had 2 pictures that I held in my mind. And these pictures were, one was he and I were hitting the pipe in my bedroom, and his daughters were at school, but my little girl, because she was only like 2, was in the home with us. And I sent her to get him a beer to get her out of our hair, you know, because little kids are, you know, they interfere with getting high. And I sent her to the kitchen to get him a beer. And at 2 years old, my daughter knew get a glass as well. You know, I mean, that was my idea of teaching my kid class, I guess, you know. And so I hear her little feet running down the hallway with a beer. And I didn't know she had the glass in her hand. And I hear this big crash. And I go out and I look on the floor, and there's my baby. Remember, this is the child of my heart. This is my gift from God. I see my baby laying on top of the shattered glass, and I pick her up, and laying against her chest is the bottom of the glass with this one piece sticking up, and it is laying against her chest. And there's nowhere that the baby could not have fallen on it, that it would not have pierced her chest and killed her. And as high as I am, I know that God has taken care of my baby. As high as I am, I look at this child that I love so much, and I look at the glass, and I look at this child, and I look at the glass, and I push the glass over to the side, and I go back and get high. The second thing I need to remember is that we're getting to the end of the dope. It's his coke, it's his works. We're not hitting the pipe anymore. We're going to start shooting it because we figure it'll make it last longer. We get to the end of the day, and it's the last bit of dope. It's his needle, it's his dope. But I think that I might be able to get that last hit. Now, somewhere in the front of my mind, I know there's no way It's his stuff. Remember, he's 1,000,000 feet tall. I can't beat him up. But because I'm in the grip of this disease, I can't not do this. I've got to do the kind of things that might get me that last hit. And in our text it says, we degrade ourselves in our own eyes. Now, when I ask you to close your eyes and remember the worst thing you did, I've got to tell you, this is not the worst thing I ever did. I did worse things. But this was bad enough. And I remember the things that I did, thinking maybe the little sexual behaviors I was willing to try, to whatever, maybe because I might get it. And you know what? I didn't. I didn't get that last hit. I didn't get it. But I still did that stuff. And so I would remember these things and I would think, I will never do that drug again. That was 2 years before I got clean. He got out of Terre Haute. It was a piece of cake. He sent me a joint on Mother's Day. I would go visit him. We would have mixed drinks in the courtyard. I mean, he was that kind of guy, you know, Mr. Charisma with all kinds of hookups and connections. And so we got us a farm thinking that people who live on farms don't have drug problems. We had goats, and we had chickens, and we had little bunnies, and we had cows. And what happened is he would disappear for days at a time. And during this period, right after we got married, I immediately got pregnant. And I knew that it was going to have a boy. I mean, I didn't need an ultrasound. I knew this was going to be a boy, and wouldn't that fix us? Because we had 3 girls, and this would be, and you know, as an addict, I'm always thinking something outside me is going to fix me. Something is going to fix me. And I thought, I have a boy, it'll fix us. What happened is we both stopped working. We were living on ADC. I have a regular job, so I just called it maternity leave, you know, and stopped working. And it was during this period that things got really violent because although I had stopped using, hitting the pipe and shooting dope, he had not. I was still, however, every day smoking reefer and drinking, every day. And I couldn't stop. And it didn't matter that I was pregnant this time. I couldn't stop this time. I couldn't even moderate this time. And I tried to leave him a couple of times. The first time I tried to leave him, he, in a blackout, he choked me and bit me over the back of the couch, choking me. And the only reason that I did not die is that my stepdaughter stepped in between us. No child should have to make those kind of calls, you know? But that was so par for our lives. That was how things were. I ended up having my son. It got worse, it got worse, and it got worse. But during this period, I had a friend who was, he lived with my best girlfriend, and he and I used to use together. And he figured he had a drug problem. Now, I have no idea, I don't know why he thought he had a drug problem. His life looked pretty good compared to mine. But he was the first person I ever knew who went into drug treatment. And at this point, I'm telling you the truth, I thought drug treatment was what you did to the dope before you put it on the streets. I said, Bob went where? And this guy was bad, but I just loved him so much. He was a biker from UP and the Wisconsin area. When you're from Columbus, Ohio, the whole thing looks like the same, UP, Wisconsin. But he was from up there, and he came down to Columbus, and he got clean. And he was the first person I ever knew who got clean. And he explained how he had this disease in his head and how he thought funny when he got high. And came home, and he threw away all his dope. And I was like, what the fuck is wrong with him? But you know what? Their lives got better, it got different, and you never know when seeds are going to be planted. You know, you just don't. Because he never lectured me. He never said, you ought to try this. He just said, this works for me. And also, what I started doing during that period was I went to these Saturday afternoon groups with his girlfriend. And they talked about how the disease affects family. And I was stunned to see my family stuff on those movies that they showed. You know how we lie for each other and how we say, no, honey, Daddy's not passed out in the front yard. He's camping. You know? Yeah, so, you know, I saw myself. I saw my family. Okay? And what happened during that period is that a seed got planted of awareness. Nothing changed, but a seed of awareness got planted. And that seed started poking its head up one night when I sent my husband out for diapers. I gave him our last $10. I said, the baby has no diapers. You need to go get him some diapers. So he leaves, and he's gone, of course, all night. And he comes back with no diapers. And during this period, now one of my character defects is self-righteousness, okay? And it was in full bloom. I was so mad that the inside of my arms was like on fire. I had my hands on my hips. You could see steam come out my ears. I was so self-righteous because I've been sitting home being this innocent, wonderful mother, alone, smoking and drinking, waiting on this fucker to come home. Okay? Self-righteous. I'm sorry, this is self-righteous, okay? And so he comes in, and there's no diapers. And I have this major attitude, and I said, well, where are the diapers? And he said, well, I didn't get any diapers, but look what I got you. And he throws this bag of reefer on the table. Now, he can't see this, but immediately, I am okay. Immediately, there is this transformation inside my overly heated body that it was on fire with anger and rage. I'm suddenly okay. That scared the shit out of me because I was suddenly aware that everything was about the dope. Everything was about the dope. I was okay. And I went and rinsed out some rags and put them on my kid's butt, you know? And I was okay. Now, I didn't stop using. I didn't stop using, but somewhere there was a seed planted. Through a series of very violent events, I ended up literally escaping. The police escorted us to the county line, and I had both of my children by a miracle. And we went into hiding for several weeks until we could end up at a shelter. I got clean in a shelter with 3 trash bags of clothes, a 7-month-old baby, and a 4.5-year-old little girl. And I'm a professional woman. I go to work every day. I've worked at the same agency for 27 years. And I was 2 people. I was the person that went to work, and I was the person that came home and got high. And you could not come to my home if you did not use. My life had no choices. My life had nothing but the dope by the time I walked in these rooms. And I didn't think the drugs were the problem. I thought it was the lifestyle. And so there was this lady at the shelter. The first woman I'd ever met who'd been clean for as long as she had. She had like 7 years, and she used to do drugs just like me. I just was amazed by her. And she said 3 things to me after I lied to her about my drug use. And, you know, there was a lot of violence and a lot of drugs. And I don't want you to think, and I'm powerless over what you think, of course, but when I talk to you about my ex-husband, I would like for you to have the true picture. And that true picture is that I was his partner. For every bad, crazy, insane thing he did, I was his equal. When I had to start doing an amends list, I had to put that man on there. Because there were times when I set him up. There were times when I knew that if I walked away, if I said, I'm done, his misery over having spent all the money, having fucked up our lives so badly, he would have gotten clean. But not me. I was such a good caretaker. I caretaked him right out of feeling any grief about having fucked up. We were partners. But by the time I got to this shelter, this lady, so I still had to lie to her about my use, but she saw through me. I told her the truth about his, but but she saw through me. You know how we are? We got this radar. And she said 3 things that changed my life. She said, Vickie, why don't you take all that energy you've been putting into getting and using, and why don't you go to a meeting? And she said, because if you pick up again, you'll go right back to him. And the 3rd thing she said is, if you don't go back to him, you will go back to someone just like him. Because by then, I could not stop the cycle of violence. And I was no longer attracted to anything having to do with a nice guy. I only found attraction to the really violent, bad guys that I knew, no matter what I did, I could not fuck them over. Because I felt so much guilt and shame about what I had done to my first husband. I used to say things to him like, well, if you make yourself a doormat, I'm going to walk on you. Like, it's not my fault. I must do this. You're a softie. I must beat you up. And not knowing how to correct that. My idea of how I was going to correct it is just get someone who is as mean as me and possibly meaner. And I found that attractive. I found that sexually exciting. I did not know anything about how to have a healthy relationship. So I came in these rooms and I started learning stuff about myself. I started learning that I'm a caretaker, and that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing, to be a nurturing, loving, giving person. But what we do with our gifts that God gives us in active addiction, this is my take on it, is that we take those and we twist these natural gifts around so we can get what we want and get our asses covered and make sure that our needs are met. So what I did with my nature is to be a loving, caring person. But what I always did is got someone who I could make dependent on me. I would always have the job. I would always have the house. I would always have something that you had to come to me for. And if nothing else, you would have to come to me for sex. And I never perfected a good time in bed because I liked you. I perfected a good time in bed because I wanted you to be dependent on me. I wanted you to come to me for what I could give you and do for you. And that made me feel secure. That made me feel like I had something going on. Now, what happened when I came into recovery and I started seeing myself as I really am, is I began to understand I just had a whole bunch of tricks. I just had a whole bunch of behaviors. I just had a whole bunch of nothing. Because it wasn't about me. It wasn't about being close to somebody. It wasn't about sharing who I am. It was about control. And I thought when I came in here that one of the things I had a handle on and that I knew what was going on and I knew inside out and I could figure out was sex. And I had about 8 to 10 years clean. And I realized that sleeping around was not working, because you ended up, one thing is if you sleep with someone and it turns out to be good sex, then what will happen is you'll bond. And you bond with this idiot. So you got to be careful who you sleep with, because if the sex is good, there you are, bonded to an idiot. So I didn't stop sleeping around because I was a spiritual person and looking for the deliverance and grace of God. I stopped sleeping around because it was not practical. It was no longer practical, and that's what the text says. If it's not practical, it's not spiritual, so we all do the best we can while we're here. And so what I did, and this is where I was blindsided by the program, and this is just an example of how I got blindsided by the program. I thought, okay, so I'll just do a few things, but it won't be actual intercourse, okay? So then I feel like Bill Clinton, But this was way before Bill Clinton, okay? okay, I can do these things and I won't have that bonding issue stuff, but I'll still have the control stuff, okay? Well, what happened is I did those behaviors that are just short of real intercourse, and I still had those motherfucking feelings. And I'm thinking, what happened? What happened? Now I can't act out in any way. I got these feelings. And what I realized had happened to me in the course of my recovery, having had a spiritual awakening, we practice these principles in all our affairs. I did not intend to have a spiritual awakening in the area of sex. I planned on just continue doing anything I wanted, anything, to get what I wanted. And this doesn't work. It doesn't work anymore. And the other thing I learned about me in recovery is that I am terrified of intimacy, terrified of it. And I had this spiritual mentor who, I had had several relationships in recovery, and about 5 years clean, which I think is a real pivotal point. 5 years, it's like then you know it's a lifestyle, okay? At 5 years clean, I had finally had my first relationship with another recovering addict. I mean, I'd been sleeping with guys in the rooms, but none of them were truly committed to recovering. This was my first relationship with a man who wanted to recover, who wanted to be a better person, who wanted to work the steps, who wanted to see what it was like to be free of active addiction. And just being in that relationship changed me, because I had an opportunity to see what it was like when I was involved with someone who was willing to work on themselves. Because I had always gotten involved with someone who was emotionally unavailable. And I thought that I got involved with people who were emotionally unavailable because I just wanted to be the sunshine of their life. Okay, the truth was, I wanted to be involved with men who were emotionally unavailable because then you will not challenge my issues of intimacy. And this guy was willing to challenge my intimacy issues. He was willing to work on that stuff. I didn't know where to go with this relationship. I mean, I didn't know what to do. I had reached like a wall. And I remember saying to someone, why don't you just ask me to grow a third arm? I am not capable of being any more intimate than I am right now. This is it. This is it. I'm a loner. I don't do intimacy. And what this person shared with me was that it was possible for me to change. It was possible for me to grow. And I saw myself so clearly as damaged goods. I am damaged goods. And we do recover. You know, what was damaged can be healed. But I didn't know that because I had never seen so clearly how damaged I was. And it was about this intimacy thing. And so God has such a sense of humor, you know, not like the ha-ha kind of sense of humor, but the gotcha kind of sense of humor. And so I went to this recovery dance, and I sat next to this guy that I know, but he doesn't know anything about my personal life. And, you know, we see each other in meetings in passing. And this is like in January. And I had decided in December that my goal for this particular year would be to learn what is intimacy. Because I could see that this was going to be a big issue in my recovery. And so I was going to spend the year trying to discover what intimacy was. So I sit down next to this guy who doesn't know me. And he turns to me and he says, "Do you know what intimacy is?" And I look at him and I go, "No." And he said, "Well, intimacy is when you can be who you really are, and I can be who I really am, and we can be it at the same time." And there went my plan for the whole year. I had no idea that God would make this so simple. I had this plan. But as my biker friend from UP or Wisconsin, wherever he was from, used to say, you can plan plans, but you can't plan results. That was my first slogan I ever heard in recovery. And so what that left me with was an understanding of why so many of our steps, most of the steps are about house cleaning, because we need to know who we are. We need to know who we are so we can be that person. We need to get rid of all the garbage that keeps us from being that person. We need to be free. That is why I am here, because I want to be free. I don't want to wake up in the morning and have to know, where's my next hit? I want to be able to choose the kind of person that I'm with, not because I'm driven and obsessed with a type of person, but because I like that person. And I like that person because we match, or maybe because we're different and I find it interesting. But I need to know who I am so I can bring that to the table. And about that same time, I started learning about the importance of my spirit, that I have a spirit, and it's essential that I honor this spirit. And one of the ways I honor this spirit is that I do things that bring me peace and joy. And when someone told me that this was one of the tricks of making your spirit big, that to find out what you enjoy and then do it, that just seemed too simple. But on the other hand, it seemed kind of complicated, because at the time, the only thing that I really liked to do was watch Star Trek. Okay, so how spiritual can that be? Well, if it brings me joy, if I find that comforting and it is not a harmful behavior to you or me, then do it. Honor your spirit. And that led me to remembering that I love music. I love gardening. I love reading. Because I'm an addict, I got too many dogs. I got 4 dogs, 3 cats, and 2 turtles. I love animals. And I love meetings. I do these things. They make my spirit big, and I'm grateful for it. When I came into these rooms, they told me to get a God of my understanding. Now, I had no doubt that when I got here, that there was a power greater than me that brought me in these rooms. I had not one bit of doubt that there was a power out there that kept me from dying my last 6 months of using, and brought me into the rooms with my 2 children. That was not of my doing. Even in active addiction, it was so clear to me that a power greater than me was watching after me, that would happen to me. But I didn't know how to relate to this God. Getting a personal relationship was kind of baffling. And what I started thinking about is, what do I know about love? If there's a God or a spirit or whatever name this power is going to have, what is that like? What does that feel like for me? And the only love that I could come in contact with was the love I have for my children. I love my children unconditionally. They could do anything, and I might not like that behavior, but my children are my heart. I cherish them. And sometimes they make mistakes, and sometimes they choose paths that I'm so hurt. But I would never not love them. And then sometimes, because I do love them so much, I need to step out of the way and let them choose their path, because that's how they know who they are. And if that, in my little tiny people mind, is the greatest love I know, then God must be that much bigger and similar. I had nothing else to compare it to. And to get a relationship with God, I started thinking, how do I get a relationship with anybody? And this is what I learned from a home group. Okay, I'm a big believer in a home group. And if you are ever in Columbus, Ohio, my home group is We Came to Believe, meets 3 o'clock on Saturdays at 21st and Mount Vernon. It is a kick-ass meeting, okay? I think you got to get a home. If you don't have a home group, get a home group. I mean, it is the foundation of my recovery to have a home group. Okay, so what happened in this home group is that I would go there, and remember, I didn't talk to people. I would try to arrive a little late, leave a little early. But what happened is by showing up every week, and I went to a lot of other meetings, but this one I made a big commitment to, they started to know me. And I started to know other people without even having to work at it, just by the consistency of showing up. Now, if that worked so amazingly well in my personal life, here on this plane, you know, it might work in helping to get to know this God of my understanding that you people told me to get. So what I had to start doing was on a consistent basis every morning, every night, have a conversation with the God of my understanding. And I would do exactly what the text says. I would just talk to whatever's out there. And initially, I would have very long, rambling prayers, very long, rambling conversations. But you know, after a while, it started to feel like I was talking to a friend. It started to feel like I was connecting with someone because I had been given the gift of consistency from this program. And this is what you told me to do. I need to persevere and be consistent. And on the days when I don't feel like God is close to me, I got to remember that a product of this God of my understanding is the ability to live spiritual principles. And spiritual principles are behaviors. So I don't have to feel like I got God on my shoulder to be kind, to be tolerant, to practice service, to be honest. Those kind of things are behaviors I can do even on a bad day. And you know, it was a real gift when someone said to me, just because you're having a bad day does not mean you're not in recovery. I thought, because I'm used to the feel-good mentality, that if I didn't feel good, I wasn't practicing recovery, you know? And I also thought, because I come from that feel-good mentality, that if I didn't have this wonderful, loving God wrapped around me, there must not be a God. And that's not true. You know, there's many things in this world that I can't see that I know are there. You cannot see the love I have for my children when I look at them in their sleep. I'm just standing there, but I love them. You cannot see the electricity that gets these lights on, but it's there. So I did the things you people told me to do. I was a latecomer to, well, I guess I wasn't a real latecomer to service work. I was a secretary when I had about 2 years clean. I was the secretary of a home group, and I would chair groups. And because I came into these rooms with 2 small children, I felt like I was an alien. There was no one else in my area who had really young children except the ones who had children while they were clean. And I would come with these 2 kids, and I would feel like, you know, like, am I the only mother that used? You know, am I the only mother that used? And I would have to pick meetings that were based on play space sometimes. And, you know, but I brought my children into recovery. We are a family. We are a recovering family. The hardest thing that I have ever done, besides give up the dope, is raise my children alone. I have never had... It's like I passed out these applications and said, if you are the most dysfunctional man in Franklin County, Columbus, Ohio, I will have your child. And so their fathers were just not involved. And they both had drug issues, and they both, you know, they just weren't involved. And I have a lot of guilt behind that, you know, especially for my son, to not have been smart enough to give him a father that would adore him like he deserves to be adored. You know, but then I look at my son and I think, man, he's so neat. He's so neat in so many ways. And if that's the dad he had that made him like that, then who am I to judge? You know? When I had about 7 months clean, I had gotten divorced. During the divorce, my ex-husband abducted our son. He was a year old the week I got divorced. And he took him from crack house to crack house, and he would call me and say, if you drop the divorce, you can have him back. And I knew that if I dropped the divorce, it was like getting clean. I didn't know if I could do it twice. I didn't know if I could get away from this man twice. And this is where I first started learning that the steps work on things other than drugs. And I started saying to him when he'd call, this is out of control. I have no control over this. I have no control over what you do. That was the first step. I'm powerless. And the second step was that that I know that this is going to be okay somehow. That there's some hope here, but this is the most insane thing up until then that had happened to me and my kids, is that I couldn't get my kid back. And then the third step was just give it to God, because where else do you go when you're truly powerless? And when I got my son back, he was so sick he had to be hospitalized, and his dad hit me for the last time. About 3 or 4 months later, I was sitting in a car dropping my daughter off at the babysitter, and my son needed to go to the doctor that morning, and we had forgotten his car seat. And this guy I was seeing in the rooms was driving, and so we had just dropped my daughter at the babysitter. My son was on my lap. We were on our way back to get the car seat, and I looked up, and it was my ex-husband coming to the car with a gun in his hand. And he emptied the gun into the car. It hit the driver in the head. My son was on my lap, and the bullet went through. It was February, and I was wearing a heavy coat. It went through my sleeves, up and down my sleeve, came out this cuff of my sleeve, and hit my son. Now it hit our son, in the only place that a child that age could probably be hit and not die. My son carries bullet fragments in his leg from that, but he didn't die. And it was during those few seconds when those bullets were flying through the car that I knew without a doubt that my son has a God of his understanding, that I am not the only one that has God taking care of me. And I've tried to remember that as my children grew up. And I believe that in the course of our recovery, God gives each one of us mountains. God designs those mountains, and he puts them in front of us, and our job is to walk up those mountains designed by God, holding God's hand, putting our foot where God says, put your foot. Because it is in climbing those particular mountains that we become the people God wants us to be. God walked me up the mountain of raising my children. Parenting was the most difficult thing I had ever done. All I knew how to do was to love my children. I didn't know how to set boundaries. I didn't know how to fix regular meals. When I first got clean, my kids would walk around the house eating because we never sat down to eat, I didn't know about bedtimes. I just didn't know these things. And I come from a regular family where someone told me, but this is the disease of the forgetter. We are the quick forgetters, and we forget. I slept on the floor my first 2 years of recovery, a mattress on the floor. My kids had beds, but it never occurred to me to have a bed. It just didn't. I might look like a regular person on the outside, but I am a dopehead. I am an addict. I have an addict mentality that takes every day to recover. And this is a Just for Today program, because there have been times in this program that I have had the most kick-ass program yesterday, but if I don't have it today, I will pick up. What works yesterday doesn't count for today. And I'm really grateful that I was able to walk in these rooms and hear even a little bit of what you people told me. I am really grateful when we pray in a circle to remember the unseen members who are not here yet. Because the longer I'm clean, the more those unseen members have a face. And I am grateful that we keep coming back. When I first got clean, I was terrified. I was terrified. And my addict, even today, my addict mentality just registers fear. I don't know the difference between the fear of having a gun held at me, the fear of not being able to pay the electric bill, versus the fear of being vulnerable. It's all fear to me, you know, and I don't handle fear really well. But what I've learned today is that I don't know how it's going to get better, but it's going to get better, and it's going to be okay. And it's not in my hands how it gets better. It's in God's hands. And what it felt like when they first told me to give up the dope and keep coming back is that I was going to climb up to the highest skyscraper in Columbus, and I was going to jump off. That is exactly how it felt. It felt like I was jumping off a skyscraper. And I didn't have any place else to go except jump off the goddamn skyscraper. And so that's what I did. And Narcotics Anonymous caught me. You know, Narcotics Anonymous taught me to build my wings on the way down. And I'm forever grateful. I have no idea what tomorrow holds. I know that if I didn't use today, I have a good chance of being clean tomorrow, but it really, really, really is about today. When I had 8 years clean, I was so totally obsessed and in love with this guy who could not put 30 days together. And I had no choice but to be in love with him. He was like the big love of my life. And after about 6 months of his act of addiction, I was so crazy and out of control that I decided that what I needed to do was use with him. Okay? Because then we would be together. Okay, now what I forgot during that period, because I was so crazy, and I believe this disease jumps off us. You know, if we're with people who use, and we're with them, well, I get crazy. My disease comes back out. It gets triggered. And what happened is I made a decision to get high with him at 8 years clean. I mean, it was the week that I had 8 years clean. And I went in and I told him that I wanted to get high with him. And you know what? There was no dope in the house. So it is not about some days that we are smart, wise, or we got a good program. Some days it is about God is just good to us. God is just good to us. And the only thing that stands between us and getting high is God's grace. You know, I did not walk in here because I'm smart, rich, well-educated, or whatever. I walked in here because I was a desperate, dying addict and had no place to go. And you people loved me until I could learn to love myself and pass it on. Because that's how this program works. Thank you for listening.